Hello, my name is Sarah and I'm 25 years old. Recently, I started helping my Uncle James by tidying up his house while he was recovering from a minor surgery. Uncle James, in his late 50s, has always been supportive and like a mentor to me. Since moving to the city for my studies, I've made it a routine to spend some weekends at his place, helping out whenever I can. One sunny morning, I decided to tackle some cleaning. The sunlight poured into the living room, making everything feel warm and welcoming. I wore a simple tank top and shorts, something comfortable for the work ahead. Uncle James was in his study, catching up on some reading, so I thought I'd have the space to myself for a while. As I hummed along to some music, I got completely lost in the rhythm of dusting and wiping. Suddenly, I became aware of someone watching me. Turning around, I saw Uncle James standing by the doorway. His arms were crossed, and he had a curious look in his eyes. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but with a note of surprise. "Morning, Uncle James," I replied with a cheerful smile, brushing off the dust on my hands. "Didn't think you'd be up this early." "I couldn't stay cooped up in the study with all this activity going on," he said with a chuckle. "You're doing a great job, by the way." His compliment made me feel proud, and I returned to my chores, aware of his gaze following me. There was something about the quiet atmosphere, the way the light filled the room, that made the moment feel different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As I reached up to adjust a picture frame on the top shelf, I lost my balance slightly. Before I could catch myself, I felt strong hands steady me. Startled, I looked back to see Uncle James holding me firmly by the waist. "You okay?" he asked, his tone full of concern. "Yeah, just a bit clumsy," I said, feeling a flush creep into my cheeks. His hands lingered for a moment before he stepped back, the warmth of his touch leaving an impression. For the rest of the morning, he stayed nearby, offering to help with small tasks here and there. Every so often, I'd catch his gaze, and our shared smiles felt more meaningful than usual. The air between us seemed charged with an unspoken connection. When the cleaning was done, we settled onto the couch with some iced coffee. Uncle James was quieter than usual, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Sarah," he began, "I really don't know what I'd do without you. This house would fall apart if it weren't for you." I laughed softly, brushing off the compliment. "It's no big deal. I'm happy to help." But his words lingered, and so did the warmth in his gaze. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it felt intimate, like we both understood something that didn't need to be said. As the day went on, the feeling of closeness stayed with me, making it a day I wouldn't soon forget. Before I knew it, Uncle James reached out and took my hand. For a moment we just sat there, his hand warm against mine. The touch felt like a quiet acknowledgement, a silent understanding that something was shifting between us. A shiver of anticipation ran through me, but there was also a strange sense of comfort, as if we were both exactly where we were meant to be. "Sarah," he whispered, my name carrying a weight that sent a small thrill through me. His voice was gentle yet filled with something unspoken, and I felt myself leaning closer, drawn into the warmth of the moment. "Yes, Uncle James?" I replied, my voice soft and uncertain, mirroring the intensity of his gaze. I've wanted to tell you something," he said after a pause, his hand still holding mine. The sincerity in his tone made my heart race as I waited. The silence between us heavy with anticipation. "You mean so much to me," he finally said, his voice low but steady. I felt my breath catch, and my fingers gently tightened around his. "You can tell me anything," I murmured, my voice shaky but encouraging. His eyes held mine, and for a brief moment it felt like the world had fallen away, leaving just the two of us in that quiet space. "You've been here for me in ways I never expected," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just glad I can help." The room seemed to hold its breath as his words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the moment. He leaned closer, his hand still wrapped around mine, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how close we were, how intimate this moment had become without either of us saying it out loud. As his face hovered inches from mine, his hand reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The tenderness of the gesture made my chest tighten, and I leaned into his touch without even thinking. "Sarah," he whispered again, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that left me speechless. "Yes?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of the moment. His lips parted as if to speak, but before the words could come, the sound of the front door unlocking shattered the stillness. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The spell was broken as both of us turned toward the sound. Panic flashed in Uncle James's eyes as we quickly stepped away from each other. My hands trembled slightly as I tried to compose myself, brushing my hair back and smoothing my clothes. The room still carried the heavy air of what had just passed between us, though we both acted as if nothing had happened. I motioned for him to step back as I reached for the door, forcing a calmness into my expression despite my racing heart. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing louder. I took a deep breath and opened the door to find my aunt, her cheerful voice cutting through the tension. She greeted me warmly, completely unaware of the charged atmosphere she had just interrupted. I smiled and answered her questions about the cleaning as naturally as I could, though my thoughts kept drifting back to the moment I had shared with Uncle James. Glancing over her shoulder, I saw him in the living room, sitting stiffly and avoiding my gaze. The connection we had shared just moments ago was replaced by an unspoken agreement to maintain the status quo. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation, though my mind replayed what had happened on an endless loop. In the days that followed, the weight of that moment lingered between us. I avoided being alone with Uncle James, and he seemed equally determined to maintain a safe distance. Yet, whenever our paths crossed, there was an unspoken acknowledgement in his eyes, a quiet understanding of the boundary we had almost crossed. One afternoon, as I was tidying the shelves in the living room, he approached me. His expression was serious but calm, his tone low and measured. "Sarah," he began hesitantly, I think. "We got caught up in a moment. I care about you, but I don't want to risk ruining what we have, or hurting anyone else." I nodded, relief and sadness washing over me in equal measure. "You're right," I said softly. "We've always been close, and I don't want to lose that. Maybe it's best if we leave that moment as a memory and move forward." He smiled faintly, a mixture of understanding and gratitude in his eyes. "You're so special to me, Sarah," he said after a pause, "and I'm thankful for everything you've done for me. Let's focus on that." From that day on, our bond shifted back to something simpler, though with a deeper undercurrent of respect and care. We laughed, shared stories, and supported each other as we always had, but with an added awareness of the line we had almost crossed. Looking back, I felt grateful for what that moment had taught me, not just about boundaries, but about the importance of connection and understanding in relationships. It was a reminder of how fragile trust could be, and how much I valued the family that surrounded me. Over time, the memory softened, becoming less about what almost was and more about what we had chosen to preserve, a relationship built on mutual respect, gratitude, and love. Uncle James's hand lingered on mine, his warmth grounding me in a way I couldn't explain. For a moment, we just sat there, the quiet filling the room like a cocoon. The connection between us felt undeniable, like stepping into uncharted territory, yet oddly comforting. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice low but filled with a weight I hadn't heard before. "Yes," I replied, my own voice trembling slightly, betraying the swirl of emotions I couldn't quite name. "I've wanted to tell you something," he began, his gaze steady but soft. "You've become such an important part of my life, especially in these past months. I don't know what I'd do without you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, the intensity of his gaze making my heart race. I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn to him in a way I hadn't expected. "Uncle James," I started, but he gently interrupted. "I know this might seem strange, and I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he continued, his tone full of sincerity. "But I can't ignore how I feel anymore." I felt my breath catch, my thoughts spinning in every direction. The vulnerability in his voice, the openness in his eyes, it was all so overwhelming. "You can tell me anything," I murmured, my voice shaky but genuine. He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I think about you, more than I should, and I can't help but wonder if you feel it too." The room felt impossibly still as his words hung in the air. My hand instinctively tightened around his, a silent acknowledgement that I understood what he was saying, even if I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. "Uncle James," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "This feels unexpected, but I can't deny there's something between us." His hand gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, the tender gesture making my heart skip a beat. "You've always been so kind, so thoughtful," he said softly. "I never wanted to cross any boundaries, but I can't ignore what's been growing between us." I nodded, the truth of his words resonating deeply. "I don't know what this means," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But it feels right, in a strange way." His face softened, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now," he said. "But I want you to know how much you mean to me." Before I could respond, the sound of the front door unlocking shattered the stillness, pulling us abruptly back to reality. My aunt's voice echoed through the hallway, cheerful and unsuspecting. Uncle James and I quickly pulled apart, our gazes meeting in a shared moment of panic. The sound of the front door unlocking shattered the moment, pulling us back to reality. My heart leaped into my throat as the realization hit my aunt was home. Panic flashed across Uncle James's face, and we instinctively pulled away from each other, hands trembling as we tried to steady ourselves. I quickly straightened my hair, smoothing my clothes and glancing around the room, desperate to erase any trace of the intimacy that had just filled the air. Motioning for him to step back, I hurried to the door, trying to look composed even though my pulse was racing. Her cheerful voice echoed through the hallway, completely unaware of the tension that had just filled the room. I managed a smile and greeted her warmly, hoping the nervousness didn't show on my face. She gave me a quick hug, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened. Over her shoulder, I caught a glimpse of Uncle James slipping into the living room, his face still pale, his movements tense. The moment had passed, leaving behind a heavy silence and an unspoken understanding. We both knew the boundary we had almost crossed couldn't be undone, and yet neither of us dared to address it directly. The rest of the evening played out in an almost surreal normalcy, my aunt chatting animatedly about her errands while I nodded along, my mind replaying every detail of what had almost happened. Later, after my aunt went to the kitchen, I found myself standing near the doorway where Uncle James lingered. His posture was stiff, his eyes avoiding mine, yet the weight of the connection we'd shared still lingered. When our gazes finally met, the unspoken understanding between us was undeniable. We both knew we had to tread carefully. One misstep could unravel everything. In the days that followed, the weight of that evening hung heavily in my mind. A whirlwind of emotions, excitement, guilt, and confusion swirled within me, battling for control. Uncle James and I kept our distance, our interactions polite but measured. And yet, the unspoken connection hadn't vanished. It was quieter, but it lingered in the spaces between us. One afternoon, while I was tidying the living room, Uncle James approached me. His face was calm, though his eyes held a seriousness I hadn't seen before. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his tone gentle but firm. "Sarah," he began, "about the other day. I think we got caught up in something unexpected. Maybe it was just a moment when we both needed something, but I think it's best if we don't let it go any further." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat, but I nodded. "You're right," I replied softly. "I care about you so much, but I don't want to risk hurting anyone or the family we both love. Maybe it's best if we let it stay as it was and move forward." A faint smile touched his lips, and for the first time in days, some of the tension seemed to ease. "You've always meant so much to me, Sarah," he said quietly, "and I'm thankful for everything we've shared. Let's focus on that." From that day on, our relationship shifted. We returned to our usual dynamic, though with a newfound respect and understanding. We laughed and shared stories, but the line we had almost crossed served as a quiet reminder of what we valued most: our bond as family. Looking back on that time, I felt gratitude not for what could have been, but for what it taught me about myself, about connection, and about the strength of relationships. It deepened our understanding of each other and brought us closer as a family, leaving me with a profound appreciation for the love and support that surrounded me.